go. So the title of my talk tonight is really a title of a book that I've recently published this year called It's Not About the Bats. And it starts off with conservation and the coronavirus. And it kind of leads into everything that's wrong with, the human relationship with nature and everything. And this is a book I kind of wrote down in the hard lockdown in South Africa. I really didn't have much to do. So I was kind of, I'm usually on the road. So I was kind of at my wit's end. So I thought, okay, well, this is a great opportunity to have a look at our situation. And the coronavirus kind of highlighted that. Now, the book starts with talking about bat-borne pandemics, of which over recent years, there have been an increasing regularity of these pandemics, especially in the last 100 years, whereas before we never really saw it. And as time goes on, we get more and more of these pandemics. And it's quite interesting that a lot of them actually originate from bats. So we know about the SARS virus that happened a decade or so ago. We know that Nipah is originated in bats. The Ebola virus outbreak in West Africa started from bats. And of course, COVID-19, although there's obviously the debate that came from a lab and other things. But it's the chances are it came originally from a bat and then jumped via another species to humans is kind of there. And so we kind of have this notion that bats are pretty bad, but it's not only bats. I mean, there are a whole lot of other animal diseases that have leapt to humans. MERS came from a camel, for example. That's quite a deadly disease. HIV, AIDS, we all know about that one. And of course, the regular bird and swine flus starting all the way back in 2019. And in actual fact, 70% of all infectious diseases known to humankind come from animals. We call them zoonotic diseases or zoonoses. So there's this notion that, okay, so animals are they are causing all these horrible pandemics that are happening with increasing regularity. And I have no doubt that COVID-19 is not the last one. But the point I'm trying to make with this, and especially with the title, is that it's not really the fault of the bats or any other animals for that matter. So it's not the fault of bats or other animals. It's really the fault of us humans. And the reason why we are getting all these diseases is because we have been tampering with nature. We are going into the wild. We're collecting wildlife. We are trading in wildlife. We're keeping them in, overcrowded markets where diseases can hop. We are then consuming that wildlife, and that's really what's happening. It's about habitat destruction. There's been studies that, at the edges of these forests, these dwindling forests, as they get smaller and smaller, these zoonotic diseases that are kind of being diluted in nature now suddenly getting concentrated. And at the edges of these forests, this is where the leap has been made. And it's quite interesting also to note that bats and other animals that are prone to give diseases like rats thrive at the edges of the forests. The other animals, not so much, but these ones do. And they're starting to pick up these diseases and then pass them over. But it's more than that. It's about overhunting, it's overharvesting, it's overfishing, the pollution, the climate change. And in actual fact, if you really look at it, it's not really about the diseases. It's about us doing what we are doing to nature. And we all know about this. And so this is how this book starts. But then it starts going into what we have done to nature. And so in terms of this talk, I'm going to be talking about the mass extinction crisis that humans have triggered, and then the responses to that mass extinction crisis. So basically, the whole point of this talk is that it's about this mass extinction crisis that really we only started to become aware of in the 1960s, early 70s. And there are two responses to that. There's what we call sustainable utilization, which is the established response, and then there's an alternative to it, which is the animal rights response to it. And I'm going to say, and in the book, and I'm going to say it now, that neither of those have been very effective in arresting that mass extinction crisis and arresting the fact that we're getting all these pandemics. So I'm going to look at two other responses, and I did in my book. And one is a philosophical term called Eco-Phenomenology, which is just a fancy word for something that we all know about, but I'll get to that later. And then I'm going to go into a traditional African ethical solution, which is essentially the same thing, but it's something that's been around for millennia. and we just have forgotten about it. So I'll get to that. But let's talk about this mass extinction, the sixth mass extinction. So, I mean, by all accounts, 1 million species are now threatened with extinction, which is a frightening statistic. Wild animal populations, by all accounts, have dropped by 2/3 since 1970, and we call this the Anthropocene epoch, the epoch of the humans. So anthro basically means human, and the scene is the epoch. So Anthropocene, which basically, if you have a look at it, started really in 1940 when things really started to get bad. And then there's some sort of little statistics down there below. Terrestrial species have dropped by 39% since 1970, 76% for amphibians, and 39% for marine species. Frightening, and it's accelerating as we go along. It's getting worse and worse, and you know, let's say another 5 or 10 years, those figures are going to look even more frightening. So the whole problem is us. It's this human-centered consumption, and it's another anthropo word. Us philosophers love using big words to make us sound clever, but essentially anthropocentrism just means human-centered, which basically centers solely on our desires, our needs, our wants. So every living being, whether wild or domestic, any bit of nature, basically is a means to our ends. We treat them as instruments for us. We don't really see anything beyond that. It's about us, and it's about our needs. And the screen thing keeps jamming. Here we go. So essentially what that does is it creates a strong sense of desire that we need to just consume things. And if it's not tempered, we start seeing animals go extinct. And right now we are watching a very, very, I mean, we're watching millions of species go extinct. But one of the ones I want to sort of bring to highlight is this tragic case of the vaquita, which is a porpoise that only lives in the Baja Peninsula and around the Baja Peninsula in Mexico. And it is the world's most endangered marine mammal. Now, I have been attending regular CITES meetings, CITES Convention of the International Trade of Endangered Species of Fauna and Flora. And there they debate whether or not to trade in species, and if so, how much. And so over the years, I've watched this debate over the vaquita take place, and countries have debated, should we trade in them? Should we protect them more? Should we, what can we do with these vaquitas? So in 2012, that was the concern. There were only 200 left. The debate raged for another 2 years. By that stage, they had halved. Sorry about the spelling mistake. And in March in 2019, 22 were left. So now we're sitting in 2021. We can probably assume that vaquitas are all but gone. Now, the problem with the vaquitas, not so much because we eat vaquitas, because we eat what they eat. And it's a fish in the same area called a totoaba. And it's fished out for its swim bladder because there's a big demand for it in China. They usually tried and smuggled out of Mexico, and strange enough, often through the United States. And the gill nets of these totoaba are the ones that are killing the vaquita. So the idea was to sort of stop the trade in totoaba, but because of local fishermen and because of government policy and all sorts of politics, everything was basically ignored. And we basically watched and documented in real time the decline and extinction of this little porpoise. So we call this strong anthropocentrism. It's this kind of greed where we're not really looking at the future of the species. We just take our existence at the expense of the survival of other animals. We don't really care. We have no regard for the future utility of the species. And there's a picture of the famous dodo. So this is another example of what we've done. So it's identified as an overriding cause of the destruction of nature. And this is what we realized in the 1960s and early 70s, that the strong anthropocentrism, this kind of greed, this random destruction of nature needs to stop. So two solutions arose out of this. And the dominant one is what we call a weaker version of anthropocentrism, which is still a sort of policy that is seen exclusively in terms of serving our interests, but We now do it with a far more tempered approach. So species in nature are treated as sustainable resources. In other words, we don't sort of wipe it all out. We think, okay, well, we need to start preserving these numbers so that we can have a future utility for these species. And that's quite a good concept because, it means that we're going to preserve the species and we're going to satisfy our needs, wants, and desires. So it seems like a win-win situation. Now, I use the fancy philosophical term, but the more common term is sustainable utilization, which is basically, preserving wildlife for the sustainable economic well-being of humans, or sustainable development, which is a prolonged use of improving well-being for humans. So basically, we are preserving animals in order to satisfy our needs, and we're going to go about that in various ways. It's such a popular thing that it's basically a global idea, and everybody seems to have adopted it. The United Nations Environmental Program have adopted it. It's been enshrined in there. The offshoot of UNEP is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Wild Species of Fauna and Flora, CITES. They've adopted it. The IUCN have adopted it. The World Wildlife Fund. So the NGOs are all adopting it. They're saying this is great sustainable utilization, and pretty much every single national government has adopted the notion of sustainable utilization as a means of conserving species as well as benefiting the wants and needs of humans. So in South Africa, for example, it's enshrined in our Bill of Rights. It's there in the Constitution, and it's been hailed as a great success. I mean, often it's cited wild herbivore populations in this country have increased 10 times since the 1960s. So really, it looks like we can't really fault this. Although we can. So there are numerous problems with this whole approach. The first thing is that there is no regard of wildlife beyond the utilization of human benefit. In other words, those species that don't have any commercial or consumptive benefit to humans, like Craig mentioned, that little frog, has absolutely no benefit. So if it doesn't pay, it doesn't stay. I'm sorry to say, and that's what's happened. And often this kind of sustainable utilization is achieved at the expense of the broader environment. So there's very little regard for the overall biodiversity. So we tend to worry about those that serve us and forget about those that do not serve us. I mean, this is all pretty much obvious stuff to most of you. And of course, ever since sustainable utilization was enshrined in all these things in the governments and United Nations and CITES since the 1970s, we still find that species are dying out at an alarming and unsustainable rate. So something is not right. So we are still witnessing the worst mass extinction of species, despite the fact that we have used this approach. So here's a classic case in South Africa, and most of you probably all know about this, and it's a fairly debatable topic, but it's one worth bringing up. Is the tragic case of the African lion, especially when it comes to South Africa, that even those animals that do have value to us as humans, it fails to preserve their wild numbers. And the case of South Africa in particular is that majority of lions in this country are not wild. Most of them are reared in captivity for hunting or trading their bones. And we know that the South African government legally exports or has a legal CITES export quota of 1,500 full lion skeletons, which they send off to Asia. The idea with that is that farming lions deflates consumers away from wild tigers and lions. The reason why we're sending skeletons to Asia is because they've wiped out their wild tiger populations and they need something to fill in the gap for their wild tiger populations. They make tiger wine from bones. So we are filling that gap with our captive lions, and that should work, right? I mean, it makes logical sense. And there's the question, did it work? But it didn't. So the legal trade basically increased the demand, and we started to see, and I saw this in my journalistic capacity, once the government kicked off that legal trade, we started to see the poaching of wild lions all over Southern Africa, particularly in Mozambique and Botswana, Zambia. So basically wild lions were getting killed. And it's exactly the same thing that happened to tigers. They tried to farm tigers in Southeast Asia, but it just increased the demand, and the demand couldn't keep up. So they went for the wild lions. Besides, it's cheaper to kill a wild lion than real one. So, and the same goes for tigers. And of course, the sustainable utilization also has a human factor. It fails to benefit most humans too, even though there's a lot of noise that says it does, but only a few benefit. It's a very, very trickle-down economics. It's not even an economy, really. Just a few people benefit. The most people that rely on wildlife and the natural world do not get any benefit or very little benefit from this. So as we see right the way through Africa, despite decades of sustainable utilization and sustainable development and all the noises being made, nothing really has changed. And that is the proof in the pudding. And of course, this whole sort of notion of sustainable development hasn't stopped the zoonotic diseases from occurring: HIV, AIDS, Ebola, Nipah, SARS, and now COVID-19. So really, this is not really a solution that seems to have worked. So we need to find an alternative to this, or something that improves this. So I just want to talk about the origins of anthropocentrism, because it's like a kind of human ego that we get stuck with. And this really is the starting problem of everything. This is the root cause of it all. And the origins of anthropocentrism, especially if you have a look from a philosophical point of view, one of the overriding questions is, what makes humans different from all other animals? Everybody asks this, and it's a common thing, because we think we are better, so we want to find out what makes us different. And way back, a few millennia ago, Aristotle said, because we are rational animals, we have the ability to reason. That's what separates us from the rest of the animals. Descartes, half a millennia later, kind of said, well, it was human consciousness. We have the ability to think of ourselves as individuals. That's what separates us. And in fact, he thought all animals, other animals, just like machine, they were robotic. They were just responding to stimuli. Now they're just things, they're just commodities. And that's exactly how we see animals to this day. And in fact, Descartes was quite a dodgy guy, and he set this whole thing going. He came up with this famous phrase, I think, therefore I am. Probably all heard about it. And essentially what that is he said, well, you know what, it's possible that everything in this world doesn't exist. It's just a figment of my imagination, like some Matrix movie. So he said, okay, well, everything I see, touch, smell, probably is just, could be a false thing. It could be like a mirage. It could be. So he tried to work out what was the only thing in the world that he knew for sure. And he came up with himself, of course, because he was the doubting guy. And the fact that he was doubting means he must have existed. And therefore, he is. Nothing else can be proven. Now, it sounds all really stupid and weird and really, juvenile to sort of come up with that. But this notion is really what is embedded in all our thinking to this day, is that the human individual is prime. So everything else is of lesser importance to us. We think of ourselves before we think of anything else. Well, most of us, anyway. And this sets off, this whole notion in sort of Western society sets off this violent epoch from Descartes onwards. Right after Descartes, Western capitalism and industrialization kicks in. And there's this rapid colonization of the world from the Europeans, and this kind of thing of take as much as you can, make as much money, get into the world and start plundering all the natural resources. And as you can see by that picture, one of the first things they did was go into Africa and start taking the ivory off millions of animals. So basically, wildlife were treated, and the people living among the wildlife were treated as commodities. Not much really has changed to this day, except the lip service that says otherwise. So obviously the overriding problem is this human-centeredness, this thing that we think we are better than anything else in this world. So then there's the alternative to this, and it's this animal rights thing, which is the standard alternative, and it kind of sort of has gained ground, but never really did, and it's not enshrined in any sort of government constitution, and it kind of it's still a fringe thing. There's a lot of noise about it. You know, Greenpeace make a lot of noise, as you can see there. There's a lot of following. You know, whenever it gets into the media, there's a lot of stuff about this. So the thing about them and the animal rights is that they say, okay, well, listen, we can't have this egotistical thing about humans. Let's value animals not instrumentally or commercially. Let's value them intrinsically, that they are valued in themselves. And it's a nice starting point. And it considers the sentience of other animals. We say, okay, look, you know, elephants also feel things, you know, they also mourn their dead, and lions also have something, and pandas are cute. And so we have this moral consideration. So it doesn't logically depend on whether we have the ability to reason, or we can ride a bicycle or read a newspaper, but whether those animals can suffer. And if we can see that they suffer, then we need to give them some form of moral consideration, and therefore we need to protect them. So does it work? Well, no, it's still anthropocentric, because really what it does is it uses the human as a center. That question, does it suffer, is centered on, it's measured against our suffering as humans. So if we see an animal that suffers similar to us, then we will afford it some moral consideration. An elephant, a lion. But what about a scorpion, or a mosquito, or a fly, or a frog that Craig showed us earlier on? I mean, do we like find it cute and cuddly? And I put up this logo of WWF because they use a panda. I mean, imagine if they used a mosquito as their logo. Would they get any kind of donorship? And probably not. So there's this kind of still this human centeredness. We're measuring everything to us. And if they are close to us, then we will give them moral consideration. So essentially what we're doing here is we're just shifting this line from humans to some other animals. But most other animals, all the amphibians, all the fish, all the insects, all the reptiles are ignored. And that is a problem with animal rights. And of course, the problem with them is they tend to focus specifically on the individual species and not the overall biodiversity. And those of you who live near Cape Town, or have lived near Cape Town for a while, will remember that story of the Himalayan tar, which used to occupy, and some of them still do, occupy the slopes of Table Mountain. They escaped from the UCT Zoo back in the 1930s or 40s, and they occupied Table Mountain. And then a few years ago, they decided, well, these tars are kind of displacing all the natural animals like the klipspringer and hurting the biodiversity, so let's remove them. And they decided to remove them. And because they're on the steep slopes of the mountains, the only way to remove these tars was to shoot them. Of course, this got the animal rights people absolutely crazy, and they petitioned to stop it. They didn't, thankfully, because quite frankly, the biodiversity and all the other species are more important than just saving one alien species. And of course, animal rights has a problem with human rights. And very often the two don't go together. So often there's an accusation, especially in Africa, this, of European or Western NGOs coming in and putting animal rights above human rights. And that is often the case. We can go back in history. Our national parks in South Africa, Kruger Park, for example, was created amidst forced removal of human settlements, which I believe are getting sorted out, but I'm not too sure at how strong that is. But I mean, it's just an example of it. In the DR Congo, local villagers are treated as poachers every time they go into the forest. Rod was talking about this issue earlier on, so that's a tricky one to navigate. And many Southern African countries have the shoot to kill policy for poachers, which is pretty harsh. You know, in Zimbabwe, you find a poacher, the rangers are allowed to shoot them if they find them with elephant tusks or stuff and they're resisting arrest. So, and the jail sentences are extremely tough there. So the impoverished communities are excluded once again from all of this. So like sustainable utilization, animal rights isn't the solution to it. So we need to find a non-anthropocentric solution. And I explore this in the book. And the first thing I do is I bring in a philosophical term called phenomenology. And it's another fancy term that us philosophers like to use. But essentially, really what it says is that the human animal is not that superior, not superior at all. You know, we might think we have greater consciousness and we might have the ability to reason and fly a rocket to space. But in actual fact, we are embedded in this world just like any other animal. We have to interact with the surrounding phenomena in order to survive. We need clean air, we need food, we need water, we need the forests, we need the biodiversity to combat climate change. We need all of this in order to survive. And that's essentially what phenomenology is. It's about the phenomena that surrounds us that we absolutely need to thrive on. And we are shaped by our experience of the surrounding environment. Everything that we see, that we hear, that we feel, the cool wind, the water, the hot air, all that kind of stuff is part of shaping our experience of the world and forms us like every other animal. So this is really what phenomenology is about. And it took exception to Descartes and Aristotle, saying these guys, it's about ego and it shouldn't be like this at all. And so essentially this was something that challenged that. But the interesting thing about phenomenology is it doesn't center on the human. It says all experience is reversible. So if I experience looking into the eyes of a lion or a tiger, at the same time, they're looking at us with the same kind of experience. And I don't know if anybody, I mean, most of you probably have had a lion stare you down, and it goes to the soul. So they have this worldview of us as much as we do of them. So there's this cross reversibility. We are not the center of the world. We are just a part of it. So this whole notion of anthropocentrism, this human-centeredness, gets broken down in interactions like this. So phenomenology goes to something which I call an eco-phenomenology, and we call it a chiasm, which is a Greek word for meaning cross-reversibility, which essentially is what ecologists call a symbiosis, in that every living creature and even the non-living entities intertwine in an ecosystem, they're all part of it and they're all interconnected. And there's this interdependence on each other. And take one out of it, the whole ecosystem begins to collapse. I mean, and we're talking even the smallest of things. So even a mosquito probably has a role to play. I'm going to give the example of the wolves in Yellowstone Park. It's quite a well-known story, but it's worth sort of mentioning here that in the 1920s, wolves were basically shot out by hunters in the national park. And the reason they were shot out is because they were seen to be detrimental to the herbivore populations, namely the elk and the deer and all that stuff. And these elk and deer were important to the people then because they provided a food source and it was a means to go hunting. And so wolves were seen as evil. It's something similar that happened in Kenya with the wild dogs a few decades ago. But the problem with that is once we got rid of the wolves, suddenly there was a proliferation of the herbivores, and suddenly the Yellowstone Park, there was overgrazing, caused soil erosions, and a whole lot of problems started happening over the years. And then in 1995, they introduced a small pack of wolves. And almost immediately, these wolves made a difference. They killed some of the deer and the elk straight away. And it obviously provided an opportunity for growth in all the plants, trees. So things started to grow back. And the trees brought in more birds. It brought in more beavers because there were more trees. The beavers created dam habitats for other species. So there were all sorts of river species that were there. The wolves thinned out the coyote population. Thus, the number of rabbits and mice increased, which in turn meant more hawks, weasel, foxes, and other predators. And then ravens and bald eagles arrived. I mean, this was all happening really, really fast. And then the bear population increased, mainly because of the carrion left behind by the wolves, also because of the berries from the new trees and shrubs. And the best part of it all is that the inanimate world started to change. The rivers started to change. The increase of vegetation basically stabilized the rivers. And the fact that the new grasslands on the valley floors and on the mountainside started to prevent more soil erosion. So immediately we saw just an introduction of one species changed absolutely everything. I do a lot of work with elephants. Elephants are the same as wolves in this kind of landscape. They often seen as the ecosystem architects and gardeners. There's a lot of noise about elephants create a lot of destruction to trees and habitat, but this is part of the natural process, as long as elephants have the space to roam. But basically, elephants increase and help support biodiversity, from mice to mammals of all sorts of creatures, including things like dung beetles, which break down the millions of tons dropped by not just the elephants, but everything. And these creatures are absolutely critical. Take this little guy out of the system, and we are finished in Africa. In fact, all around the world, because dung beetles are everywhere, even in the Arctic. So this is really, really what it's about. It's about all species, the importance of all species. So everything that exists, the well-being of us, and I'm talking about not just the pandemics, but I'm talking about the fact that we are suffering with a climate crisis, which is going on at COP26. It's all about the biodiversity that needs to be protected, not the individual species, whether it is instrumentally or intrinsically valued. It's about everything. Our ethical obligation is to include the entire natural environment, not just those species. Now, the interesting thing is I introduced this fancy word phenomenology, which only came into being in the 1930s, 40s as a response to Descartes. But in actual fact, it's something we all really know. And it's something that has been in Africa actually longer than any other civilization. It's been here through millennia. And it's still prevalent amongst traditional communities through Africa. And one of the things that we all know about here in South Africa is a thing called Ubuntu, which is this non-individualistic ethic. It's not about the individual. It's not about me, as Descartes said. It's about how people can only be people through other people. So it's a kind of community or communal thinking. So rejection of the primacy of the individual. But the interesting thing here about Ubuntu is it's not just about people. And there's an offshoot of this. I'm going to just highlight this in Zimbabwe called Ukama, which is a Shona word, which means the interdependent of all that exists. It's basically everything that is connected. Everything is related and depends on one another for the existence. And this has been around forever. And it's not just in Zimbabwe, it's throughout Africa. This kind of thinking, especially in those natural spaces where people rely on nature for their existence. So as I mentioned, it doesn't depend only on humans, but also on the natural world of animals, plants, and other elements, everything. So the well-being of us and the well-being of the rest of the world cannot be separated. So the possible solution is that we need space for biodiversity to thrive. We need to actually reverse what we're doing and get back to an expanded version where nature can thrive. So it's about the commitment towards the entire system. And this is the key, especially with this COP26 going on, is yes, it's about emissions, but as importantly, if not more importantly, it's about protecting and expanding biodiversity in our natural spaces. And governments need to buy into this thinking. The whole notion, like at CITES, of protecting individual species is not going to work. The trade and utilization of some species and not others doesn't work. The protection, because of the notion of suffering and moral consideration of some species, is not going to work. It has to be absolutely everything. The forests, the water, the air. It's all logical to us. Everybody thinks this is logical. So I don't know why we can't get it going. But, and this is the big but, as individuals, we can start doing something straight away. Now I'm going to throw out a controversial topic, which I brought up in my book, is as individuals, if we want to help create space for biodiversity, we've really got to look hard at our consumption of meat, of beef in particular, because one of the main causes of deforestation, particularly in the Amazon, which big lungs for the world and elsewhere, is the reduction or the deforestation of the Amazon forest in order to plant crops, in order to feed cows, in order to feed us. And that is perhaps one of the biggest things we can do in order to create space for biodiversity. If we all start reducing our consumption of meat, and again, especially beef, we will make a difference. But it's a debatable thing. And from now onwards, because I'm about to finish my talk, let's open that up and let's think of other solutions, perhaps, that we can do as individuals in order to protect and expand our natural biodiversity. Thank you.
We're in England at the moment, but our second home is in Kenya, and we introduced ourselves last week. Can I first of all say how delighted we are in Britain that a South African has got the Booker Prize? This is nothing to do with the lecture today, but it's wonderful. And also how nice it was that when he was interviewed on BBC this morning, he said that the book is about Africa for Africa. He emphasized Africa as a continent, and Margaret and I applauded at the time, even though we're only pseudo-Africans. I just wanted to say, and I tried to send a message and half of it went, may I urge caution over the term animal rights. Here in Britain and elsewhere in Europe, animal rights and animal welfare are distinct. I'm an animal welfarist, and I'm sure everyone on this program today is. Animal rights people to us in Britain and in Europe are people who can, not always, but can be quite fanatical in their actions. I have to say, without sounding xenophobic, that the Americans muddle it because they keep talking about animal rights when they mean animal welfare. But I'm sure a South African will follow the trend on this side of the Atlantic. So I'm putting in a plea for sensible animal welfare, which should be part of conservation and our thinking, as opposed to animal rights, which can be very focused and very negative. Thank you.
Okay, is there anybody else that would like to ask? Christina, I'm asking you to unmute.
So I would just respond to that. I guess there's always exceptions to that, to any generality. But there are those in animal rights who have the view, similar to many indigenous cultures, that was just described by Adam, that animals, that people are not above, but are part of nature. And so that each species has its rights. And in that, I see a difference, because in many cases, those for animal welfare still see them as commodities to be used, so long as they're treated well. And so in my mind, you're distinguishing rights by taking away the supremacy of the human species, and that all else serves the human species.
Yeah. Good point, Christina. I mean, the whole thing about animal rights, I mean, there are different kinds of rights. I mean, you get inalienable rights, and then you get, you know, voting rights and things like that. So I mean, these things all kind of differ. So there is a sort of broad band where the rights in terms of animals, the right to exist, the rights not to be exploited. I mean, that taps into, John, what you're saying about welfare. So it's that kind of very broad gray topic. When I spoke about animal rights, I'm really having a beef against the notion of moral consideration based on suffering, and that kind of anthropocentric idea that suffering is measured against human suffering. And I think that's where the problem lies.
Thank you, Adam. I'm not seeing any other questions, so I'm going to throw in a question of my own. Christina, are you done with your question?
I just would like to respond to that, and I would agree with what you're saying, except I would also reference as well many indigenous cultures that have attributed spirituality and other cultural values to their perception of animal rights as just being part of a cycle. So there is a moral component that I think derives from that. I mean, I hear what you're saying, Adam, but there are, especially in indigenous cultures, an attribution of a morality or an ethics or a spirituality to the place of humans in this world.
I totally agree with you. I mean, I think, so one of the big problems is the exclusion when it comes to this kind of solution is the exclusion of humans. To say, all right, well, the humans are the problem, so we must get rid of them, and we must just block off the natural space and kick all the humans out of it. That is the first problem that we're going to have. Humans are an integral part of this world as much as everything else. So we need to include the human in this, and especially those cultures that are embedded in nature and part of nature and are helping to protect nature. So those indigenous and I don't really like using the word indigenous communities, but those communities that live within these spaces are absolutely crucial to conservation.
Thank you, Adam. I wanted to just ask whether you were familiar with some of Alan Savory's work, because it's kind of against the concept that we need to stop eating beef. In fact, he's encouraging that we eat beef. So I'd just like your point of view with regards to that.
Yeah, so the beef I have with the beef industry is a commercialization of cattle, you know, in these huge feedlots. I mean, it's obviously a completely different scenario when we're talking about pastoral cattle herders in Africa. We're talking about these massive feedlots. We're talking about this industry where you know, something ridiculous like 80 to 90% of the soy population that is a soy plantation that is planted to replace the Amazon forest goes to feeding cattle that then in turn feeds us. That to me that just makes no sense at all. So if you're going to eat meat, two things: try and reduce the consumption of meat, or find out exactly where that beef is sourced from. If it's local and it's, you know, like living in Africa, it's a little bit better. South Africa, not so much. You've got to be careful where that comes from. But, you know, try and not support these massive conglomerates, this industry that is causing deforestation. I mean, and studies have been shown, and there's a study, and I've mentioned it in my book as well. There's a study in Europe that if you halve the consumption of beef in terms of if you stop the crops that only feed beef by half, you will be doubling the food production for Europe, basically. I mean, that's essentially what those figures are. And that makes a big difference.
Cool. Thanks very much, Adam. I just also want to highlight a point from, and I see you, Judith. I will unmute you now for Adam. But I wanted to highlight a point that Fran Gebhardt has made as well, saying that I can never understand the word trade in CITES. Personally, I find it despicable.
I love it. I love it. I love it. Yeah, I absolutely spot on. I mean, the whole notion of CITES is it's been presented as a conservation body, but the fact that it talks about the convention in the trade is not really a conservation body. It's about trade. It's about economic trade. But having said that, we've got to be very, very careful about how we look at CITES, because too often CITES are seen as this entity that, you know, needs to be admonished and needs to change its ways. The problem is CITES isn't an entity. It's an entity of 184 countries that all have to deliberate on whether or not they trade in species, or if they do trade, how much. So it's a tricky body to deal with, and at the moment it is really all we have. And there isn't anything that's going to be able to replace it, especially at this kind of United Nations level. And we all know that United Nations is a bit of a damn squib when it comes to any kind of enforcement. But CITES actually, out of all the United Nations bodies, is actually one of the strongest ones. It does have an enforcement possibility, and there are ways where things get changed. I'll give you an example. In 1989, all African elephants were placed on Appendix 1. And this was after, in the 70s and 80s, millions of elephants got slaughtered for their tusks and the ivory industry. And after 1989, from the period to 1989 to the period of 2008, elephant populations started to come back and stabilize. So there is an argument that if done right, CITES can be effective. It's just a really slow, difficult machine to operate.
Thanks very much, Adam. Judith, I'm going to unmute you. Edom, I see your hand is raised. I'll unmute you after Judith. Judith, I'm asking you to unmute.
Thank you.
Judith, you may ask your
you.
question.
Am I unmuted?
Yes, you're unmuted.
Okay. Okay. The only thing I wanted to say about meat eating is that I find it seriously disturbing that something like, and I haven't got the figures to hand, but something like 80% of birds alive on the planet at this moment are chickens, and something like 70 to 80% of mammals alive on this planet are beef, cattle, or sheep, are things we eat. And when I look at those kinds of numbers, I fear for the future of biodiversity, because we're taking up all the room that other species used to exist on. And all of a sudden, we are filling these spaces with things we can eat. So there has to be some kind of change in our whole behavior. And I absolutely agree with Adam. There has to be a change in our behavior, because we cannot populate the earth with animals that we eat. We need to allow space for animals that we don't farm and eat. And, you know, that's just a terrestrial situation. When we get to the sea, we realize that we're just plundering a whole lot of populations of animals that are, what can I say, that they're wild and based on, and their regeneration is based on local productivity of the oceans. How can we possibly survive like this? We have to stop this whole idea of insisting that we have meat and 3 veg every day, at least once a day, maybe twice a day. We have to change our behavior. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. Yeah, well said. I mean, I couldn't have said it better myself. So you're absolutely
Adam?
correct. I mean, most of the animals on this planet are either us or animals that we farm and eat. Very small percentage is actually wild animals. So we need to change. We have to change our behavior, and we got to do it. And it doesn't have to be that drastic. I mean, like you say, we don't have to do the three veg and meat every single day. Let's do it. You know, let's start with a meat-free Monday, for example. Or a meat-free January, and then build from there. I mean, I tried it 8 years ago. I decided I was a typical South African meat-eating guy, and I stopped. I became vegan, and it actually was surprisingly easy to do. Obviously, it involves a little bit of thought, but you can do it, and it's actually fantastic. So it can be done. It can be done. You don't have to be as drastic as me, but a little bit less.
Judith, do you have a response to that?
No.
Okay,
No,
cool.
that's
I
fine.
saw you nodding your head, but your camera hasn't got you in focus. So you're only getting the top of your head. Thanks very much, Judith. I'm going to mute you.
Yes.
Edom, you've got a question for Adam. I'm asking you to unmute.
Hello.
Hello.
Greetings to everybody in the house. I'm really excited to listen to this wonderful talk today. And I thank the presenter for the nice lecture. Today, I become a little bit confused. Confused in the sense that as I listened to the lecture and I enjoyed all the presentation to the extent that I wish the listeners at the house were of similar background. Similar background in the sense that back here in my area, Nigeria, you'll find out that the situation we are discussing is like a situation of somebody who had maybe a minor thing like a heat rash on the body, heat rash, all right? And then he thought that he was dying because of his heat rash until he met someone with leprosy. And then you realize that your heat rash was nothing. So the question I want to ask the presenter is, have you thought about a meeting point where the man with the heat rash and the guy with the leprosy can come to an understanding? Yes, we all have a problem. And you with the heat rash, your problem is very, very minor, superficial, so to say, whereas the other one is malignant. So, in direct terms, somebody's complaining about farming the animals and clearing the land and so on and so forth, populating the planet with domestic edible animals.
Turn off his camera. His camera is off. Edom, we've lost you. Your connection seems to be.
Now, we don't have. Oh my God! Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now.
Hello?
But we've missed about the last. We missed about the last sentence or two.
Okay, I was talking about if he has thought of a meeting point between the man with the leprosy and the man with the heat rash,
Yes.
whereby in direct terms, in Nigeria, we have neither the domestic animal for the people nor the wild animal for the people. We're losing both sides because of the system. So, in other words, how do we balance conservation in a situation like this? Do we have to develop specific unique conservation strategy for Nigeria and countries like Nigeria, where consumption of the animal is at reckless abandon, people eating dolphins and things like that without regulations? How do we handle this? That's my question.
Thank you, Edom. So that is the question. That is the question. So this is what we need to try and find out. What is the solution? If it's not working, if the system is not working, how are we going to find that alternative? And especially in a country like Nigeria, where are we going to find that solution where we can't just say, okay, well, stop eating the wildlife and stop, other things, stop plundering the oceans. It's not as easy as that. But there has to be some way that the solution has to come. Now, unfortunately, governments need to play a part in this. They've got to make it easier for their citizens to be able to protect biodiversity as well as have enough food and enough money to survive. How, and especially in a continent like this, how does one go about that? And that's probably, let's open that up to everybody. Chris asked that at the beginning. Let's see what are those kind of solutions that we can make. We can all say, okay, we can stop eating meat, but in a situation where people are starving, that kind of solution doesn't apply. So what is the alternative?
Right.
Good question, Edom. Very good question.
Clive Horlock had his hand up. I can't find Clive on the. on the.
I've asked him to unmute, Alistair.
Okay, thanks, Mary.
Okay, it's unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes, Clive, please go
Hello.
ahead.
Yes, if I could maybe just make a comment rather. Yes, thanks for your talk. I find it fascinating because I'm privileged enough to work with Bushmen, and I did do a talk recently on my experience with Bushmen, and I've become rather a student of their culture. I'm not an expert, but it interests me the fact that we now have intellectuals and scientists that are providing us with evidence to show that the way the Bushmen lived and the first people 50,000 years ago was the way that we should be living. And we basically need to undergo a cultural and spiritual transformation to get to a point where we are going to survive on this planet. And I don't think there's any other silver bullet solutions, but to change the way we think. And this goes deep, and it goes into our psyches, and it goes into our ego. And I believe that this is where our biggest problem lies. Where the Bushmen, for example, would be suppressing ego, we now have a society where we boost ego and then exploit it. And we've actually now got a sense of values that are no longer human values. And at schools, they're not even taught these values that the Bushmen would learn in the bush with no access to all this information we got today. So I think the answers are out there, and Indigenous knowledge has got so much to share with us. And this is what I'm trying to do, and especially with young people, because they're not going to hear this knowledge from their curricula at this stage. And this is where I would like to see, more exposure given to the recipe that made these hunter-gatherers the most successful society in human history.
Yeah. I absolutely spot on. I mean, and that's a point I was making. I mean, these concepts have been around since day one, and really throughout Africa. So, Africa actually has a lot to teach the rest of the world. If we're going to do this right, let's have a look at the traditional African overview and worldview of how nature is going. And I always make this point often, especially at CITES, is that most African governments actually even think like this as well. Kenya, Gabon, and parts of West Africa and Central Africa, it's this kind of notion that everything belongs with nature and nature belongs with everything. It's just really this kind of European concept that nature must be commodified and that money must be generated from nature in order to make a profit for the individual few in a capitalistic system. It's not going to work. So the concepts, the policies of Southern African nations, for example, South Africa, Namibia, Zimbabwe, this kind of notion is a European process. It's not an African process. The sustainable utilization and the trading some species and the ranching of wild animals and the rearing of domestic lions or captive lions is not an African concept. And it's a concept that is proven time and time again, this European one, that fails. So we need to find those solutions. And I think Africa, like you say, has the answers.
Thank you. And yes, I believe Africa needs to develop its own cultural identity now and try and take some of this nonsense away. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Clive. Liesel, I'm going to ask you to unmute. You've got your hand up.
Good evening, thank you. In the chat, Eddie Fourie made the comment, educate, educate, educate. Now, I need to make a case for the smaller organisms and quickly just educate everybody on the poor mosquitoes. The role of the male mosquitoes is that they are actually a very important pollinators. And in the case of the females, and especially the juveniles, if they in the aquatic stage, they're the food source for everybody. Now, in Afrikaans, we have to have a saying, die een se dood is die ander se brood. So meaning if you die for the sake of something else. So sorry, but I just need to educate. But on the point of education, the question I want to ask is, I know it's been for a while in the discussion that it's time that we change the geological timescale, that we actually add the Anthropocene to the geological timescale. Will that not be also a way to really shock people to really what we are doing? And I'm also an educator, and I always tell the students, if we do make the geological time scale, we must not go, yay, we must make it. We must go, oh, bullshit, we're there for the wrong reasons. Is that not a way to start shaking up people in what we're doing?
Yeah. Absolutely, Liesl. I mean, thank you for the mosquitoes. They are important as well. So yeah, I mean, education is an absolutely critical thing here with everything, and especially, I mean, somebody mentioned that, you know, it's got to be in the curriculum, and I think that's absolutely essential. And I see John Hanks was on here. I don't know if he's still on here, but he was definitely on here earlier. And I had the privilege to go with him once to the Lapalala Wilderness School, which actually I was one of the first attendees back in 1983. And that's like a wilderness school, which they got the sort of, at that stage, the privileged white kids to go and learn about stuff. And now it's kind of morphed into bringing it into absolutely everybody. And it's really important to learn about nature and your concepts that you know about, that you're living around, especially those schools that are living around, say, the Lapalala Wilderness, which are benefiting from that. So that kind of education, I think, is absolutely critical. Go back to what is all around us, really. Let's learn about what's around us and not what's over there.
Thanks very much, Adam. Thanks, Liesl. Unfortunately, John is no longer with us on the call. There were a couple of comments. I don't see any hands raised at this point. So I'm just going to go through some of the comments that came up in the chat. And Sabine Redmiller said, I was just wondering, are we not maybe romanticizing the Ubuntu concept, which is a creation from the West looking at presumed African culture? Folks in Tanzania don't know this term. Consider how cruel animals are, sometimes considering how animals are sometimes treated, donkeys, etc. Just wondering. Adam, if you've got a comment on that.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, very good point. I mean, I just use Ubuntu as a South African example. It does tend to be a worldview. And yes, I totally agree with you. In many cases, it has been romanticized, but it is still something that is embedded within many traditional African cultures throughout the continent, is this notion that the individual self is not the primary thing. It's about the community, it's about people, and it's about the interaction with nature. Not just nature. Somebody mentioned spirituality as well. It's about your ancestors. It's about your spiritual needs, but everything is interconnected into one, and that is a given. That's not romanticizing anything. So, you know, speak about the San in the Kalahari. That's how they think. The Baka in the Congo, and in fact most communities have this kind of notion. So it is there, and unfortunately, yes, there is a lot of cruelty towards animals. There's a sensation that donkeys, for example, are treated really badly, and I've seen it as well. And that I believe is a symptom of modern society, of a society that values the sort of rush to try and make a profit as an individual's goal, and trying to harvest things in order for you to sort of satisfy your own needs and wants. And I think that's really where that kind of cruelty comes from. I don't think that level of cruelty kind of exists naturally. That's just my viewpoint.
Thanks very much, Adam. There's another comment here from Patricia Awori saying, sadly, CITES has morphed from a conservation body to a trade body, and that was not the intent. The UN is front and center at climate talks. Listening to you, it should be clear that it must move back to what it was intended for.
Yeah, I mean, spot on. Patricia Awori, who is from Kenya and a legend in the conservation world, and somebody who attends all the CITES meetings and has done since 1997. So she's absolutely correct in that there's this shift in CITES, particularly among within the Secretariat and some of the nations, that trade favors conservation, and that's not what the intention was with CITES. The original intention was a genuine protection and conservation of species, but now it's got to the point where it's just about horse trading. One government trades off against another in order to get as much resources as possible. So that's really what's happening at CITES. And it, as Pat says, it needs to go back to its origins. And I mean, the idea really and the goal is to get it there.
Thanks very much, Adam. Richard Matsabedi, you've got a question for Adam. I'm asking you to unmute. Richard?
Yeah, thanks. Thank you. Mine is about expression of natural resources in monetary terms, ecosystem services, because I think I get Adam's position that natural resources shouldn't be more like viewed as commodities that benefit capitalists, you know. So do you think it's a good way of showing that natural resources have value and are important, and therefore a way to encourage conservation by tagging natural resources with some monetary value?
Okay, yeah, another very good question. So, I mean, the thing about natural resources is, first of all, we've got to try and understand that we need healthy soils and crops and forests for our own well-being, for our own health and well-being. So once we start plundering that, we actually harming ourselves. So the way to look at it is to say, especially, let's say you are from a rural village in Zimbabwe or Botswana. What can be done in order for those people to first of all benefit from those resources without a few running away with all the resources, which is often the case. So it's almost like the community needs to benefit as a whole. The natural environment needs to benefit. And so this is how we go back to this kind of thinking where it's communal, it's small scale. But again, there needs assistance there. There needs to be a climate by government, maybe by private sector, to help people benefit from this without having to struggle and without other sort of outsiders coming in and taking all those resources. And that's the key to everything. So monetarizing it just for the few is just going to create problems. But what's the solution? Again, you know, here we go. We keep coming back to this problem. How are we going to deal with it?
Thank you.
Thanks, Richard.
Thanks, Richard. Which brings us to a question that was put into the chat as well by Judith, going, thank you, Adam, for your talk. How do we share these ideas? How do we get it across to the general populace?
Yeah, $1 million question. So it starts with you. So this is what I did. So the reason I became vegan 8 years ago, and I just went on a full-on plant-based diet, was really if I'm going to make a difference, I've got to start with myself. And so I've found that once I started doing that, and people have looked at me and said, okay, well, you're a South African male and you're in conservation and you're in the bush all the time. How's this possible? How do you get away with not eating meat on your fire and everything? So that kind of thing starts people at sort of assessing things and working things out. And once that starts to happen, and once they can see that you're not dying of starvation and that you're not, you're not looking pale and everything. I mean, I'm an 85-year-old guy. I mean, I'm at the peak of my. I'm just kidding about that, by the way. I see some people looking at me seriously. But But that's the thing. So start with yourself, start with what you're doing, and then just talk to other people. But one of the things I have found is don't pontificate. You know, you show people by your actions rather than telling them what to do. You know, one of the big charges against vegans and vegetarians, and they always say, you know, how do you know someone's a vegan? They'll tell you. And that's the trouble. They kind of sit there and they lecture you and they stand on this moral high ground. That's not the way to go, because people are just going to dig their heels in and get aggressive. So just do it yourself and don't judge anybody else. And that's how it starts. And that's how you convince other people.
Apologies, Alistair. I'd just like to mention another way that you can spread the word is by buying Adam's book and give it to somebody for Christmas.
Thank God. Thank you.
Johan, what percentage are you getting for all the sales that you make?
I don't know yet.
Listen, it's all about the community, hey, not the individual profit.
I've got a question that that I would like to just draw us back to the reference that you made, Adam, of Craig's little frog, and that point that you made is that he's got no value, and therefore we wouldn't consider him. But isn't there a case to be made for flagship conservation there? Because the fact that rhino or that elephant that Craig showed in his previous slide with that oil trap in front of it, perhaps that shows us that because that elephant exists, we've got conservation space for that frog. And you're managing an entire conservation system as a result of it.
Yeah. Okay. Very good point. And then often in conservation circles, that's exactly what happens. Is if you manage the charismatic animal, their habitat, then you are managing the habitat of all the other species. And of course, you know, the great umbrella species like an elephant, that requires a huge expanse of land, natural space to thrive, then we are supporting a lot of other species, and that is absolutely critical. And there is a case for that. The danger, however, for that is that if you focus solely on that, so for example, the case of rhinos, and this is a very contentious topic in this country, but the survival of the species is not just about the species. So like in a lot of conservation circles in South Africa, we concentrate specifically on the population of rhinos, but we ignore the biodiversity where those rhinos exist. So farming rhinos for the consumption of their horns is not helping other species. Game ranching, providing buffalo, and remember I said in South Africa, they all put it up as a big example, herbivore populations have increased 10 times since the 1960s. They forget to tell you that most of those herbivore populations are farmed. They are not existing in a natural space. They're existing in a ranch. That is not saving the frog. So when you start talking about that, it has to be, if we're going to talk about conservation of elephants or lions or other flagship species, we've got to talk about them and the environment that they exist in, not just the species. And that's also a problem with CITES. They think only in terms of numbers. It's not about the numbers. It's about the environment that those animals exist in.
Okay, cool, thanks. And I've got a question here from Michelle Sussman saying, what about the fish? It's not been mentioned. But it says, what about fish and byproducts of artfully produced vegan food and pesticides used on vegetables? I mean, I think we're starting to head down a wormhole here.
Not at all. These are good questions, very good questions. In fact, I addressed both those questions in the book. There is that whole notion of pesticides and the insects that you're killing and yes, it does happen. But you're also doing the same thing of all the cattle feed. So, you know, which one are you going to do? So, but I'd go into a little bit more depth about that. In terms of the fish, absolutely spot on. The fish are one of the least ignored animals in the world. Even at a CITES level, I think it took them 30 years before they even listed a species of fish onto CITES. And even then, mammals are far more on CITES in terms of endangered traded species than fish, even though fish are more in terms of the numbers of species by far. So it's a big issue, and it's one that needs to be looked at in a lot more thoroughly, and people do. I mean, and I myself have done investigations. I've had a look at what happens in the pet trade in terms of fish in Indonesia and the aquarium trade, and it's horrific what we are doing to those endangered species because of the demand for the pet trade hobby and the aquarium trade, just so that us humans can look at them for a few seconds and feel nice about it.
Thanks very much, Adam. Christina, I don't know if you had your hand up or if you were applauding on one of the comments that we made. I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Just applauding. The last several comments were just applauding. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm not seeing any further questions. I'm surprised Marty hasn't asked a question this evening. Are there any questions on the floor? I'm not seeing anything in the chat at the moment. I will say this, Adam, we've still got 41 participants in the room, so we've got a very lively debate going on because everybody's hanging on, waiting to see what's going to be said next.
We are a small amount of people left, and Maret has allowed everybody to unmute themselves, so you are welcome to chat and ask questions and debate, or just chat.
Well, Adam, I just want to say that thanks. It was a great talk, but and I'm sorry I couldn't contribute more to the Q&A session because we've had bad internet. Yeah, it stopped as soon as you finished your talk. So the gods were watching us, so we could at least watch everything. But yeah, that was very cool. Thanks a lot for doing it. We'll get you to do a follow-up sometime next year.
Thank you, Rod. Yeah, yeah, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
And you've still got to come and visit us. Hey, vegans are our favorite clients.
Yeah, good. Well, you know, here we go.
Sorry, my
Great,
wife
Rod. I'd love
just
to.
hit me on the back of the head. Did you see that?
Yeah. Make it difficult for you. Yeah. Well, there's an interesting. I mean, here's an interesting question. I mean, you find yourself in the depths of Africa, in the middle of nowhere, and you know, the only thing you can really eat is what's put in front of you. You can't exactly turn around and say, sorry, you know, I only eat melanzani and aubergine. So there is a little bit of debate around that one as well. And I found myself in those situations before. So, you know, what does one do? Does one go starve, or do you eat, you know, break the mold? So I tend to try and think of it from a holistic point of view and just say, well, as long as I'm not contributing to the sort of overall loss of biodiversity. So I'm less about animal rights in terms of what that animal meant and instead I worry more about what it's doing to the overall biodiversity. And so there is a little bit of give when it comes to something like that.
Yeah, I got there a very funny experience with my student that came from the US to work with me in Nigeria, and in my little city, she couldn't find pizza to eat, and then I kept driving for kilometers each day to look for where she can find vegan food, and it was almost impossible. Honestly, that wrecked study relationship. The collaboration collapsed.
Yeah, I can imagine. So in a situation like that, if you're visiting and that's it, you've just got to do it, and you know, it's not going to kill you, so it's fine. You're just going to have to, otherwise you're in trouble.
Prof. Enyang, it's very good to have you back on again. We missed you.
Thank you. I've been wanting to join you, but the network has been a hell of a problem down here for a while. So today I was lucky to be in a location that I had network, and I joined. That's why I'm not using the camera. It's dark somehow, but I'm very happy to be back.
Right.
Right.
I want to be like devil's advocate on a whole lot of these statements, because what I've liked about it is there's nothing that I don't agree with as far as what you've put forward, Adam, but there's obviously a different doctrine of thought when it comes to the whole concept of meat, the whole concept of veganism, fish, those sort of things, cheese, milk. And if we didn't have consumption of cheese, milk, beef, sheep, pigs, chickens, why would we keep those animals on the planet? And it is a very self-centered question to be asking, I think. But I think that's human nature, is we've got to move away from, and it's your point, I think, is that we've got to decentralize the human and look at it from an ecological perspective.
Right, so that comment automatically puts the value of those animals, those domesticated species, as tied to the human, right? And my typical answer is, we might not breed the millions into existence that we're currently doing, right? And so the likelihood the entire world will go vegan is pretty low, but we might get back to a more pastoral farming and away from deforestation to take up, what, 75% of the land space to breed millions of these animals into existence.
Totally spot on, Christina. Absolutely spot on. So if we start reducing, I mean, like she said, Christina said, we're not going to stop it. We're not all going to go vegan. I mean, I'm not advocating that at all. But what we do need to do is go back to something where we think about what we eat. For example, I mean, these chickens that you eat, and they call them chickens, they're just chicks that have been fattened up that they can't even walk at a couple of weeks old. They're just big chicks, and then we slaughter them and put them into our shops and our supermarkets. I mean, this kind of breeding is nonsensical, just so that we can sort of satisfy our I don't know, rampant needs. So, we got to think and start, really worrying about this planet. I mean, this whole COP26 thing, it's about that. Let's really worry about it. Sure, we can worry about the emissions. Like I said, they're important, but we also need to worry about biodiversity and nature. That too is going to solve the climate crisis.
One of the best ways,
if you see,
sorry, Rod, go for it.
If you see, if all the domestic chickens disappeared from the planet, the wild stock, the red jungle fowl, still exists, and it's a stunningly beautiful bird in its natural habitat. It really is. It's really a nice looking bird. I've seen it in Nepal and in Thailand, Malaysia. It's really a stunning bird, and they're not going to go extinct, but they're certainly far from it. But they're stunning birds, and you see chickens in cages. They look nothing like their ancestors. It's sad.
Yeah, absolutely true.
Perhaps we also have to consider how to get along better. I'm reflecting on Edam's observation. Much of Central and West Africa, they don't have a great deal of grass, and so they are dependent on what they get from the forest, or from the oceans for those who have coastlines. Maybe we should be thinking about those local communities who are pastoralists, who could be uplifted and from poverty in exporting what they have. They don't have in great excess. I think we continue to, Adam, as you know, in these many meetings, we are perpetually bombarded with the fact that if we do not allow people to subsist from nature, then they will not survive. But we don't think about how we can share what we have. We think about trade only in endangered species, but we don't think about trade in terms of the domestic species, and not in excess, so that we get to a point where we are seeing the type of farms we are seeing in the West, where there are excessive number of animals kept in very confined spaces. We should be, we don't all, each and every country doesn't have to be self-sufficient, is the point I'm making. You know, we can each be able to share what we have, or to export. I can export to the neighboring country what we have. It will benefit the economy, but it will also ensure that people are able to survive on what they have. I'm not seeing, being an African myself, I'm not seeing quickly a time when they are going to become vegan in my lifetime. So I think that, you know, I think the idea of excess is something that is being promoted as a good thing. And I think we have to get back to the question of balance, the traditional way of doing things, balance. We don't need anything in excess, but there's this terrifying fear that if we don't have these massive quantities of things, then we might be in danger of starvation. And frankly, there is an excess. I think we have seen enough cases of food being disposed of because it's not being sold. So we have to get back to that existence so that we can ensure that we can thrive.
Yeah. I agree there, Pat. I mean, so this would be a great solution, you know, in Africa. You're absolutely spot on to expect, you know, people to suddenly just go vegans. That's just not it's an unworkable thing, especially in the sort of impoverished rural communities. And as you say, this is where the solution is to try and support small scale agricultural programs that will help those people, first of all, put food on their table, and second of all, earn a living. And that's potentially in places like that the best solution we can do. The question is that how does one go about that? Who's going to step up to the plate and assist with things like that? Is it government? Is it the private sector? Is it NGOs? And then with all that comes a whole host of things. But the concept is absolutely correct. And this is the way it's got to be done. Small scale agricultural practices that aren't in, you're not just producing millions of tons of beef to export all around the world, but you are doing something that is providing a sort of regional or localized source of income and an industry.
There is something I want to share with us quickly. I lived in Ethiopia for about 3 years some time ago, and as a stranger visitor in this country, one thing that amazed me was the fact that the people of Ethiopia culturally don't eat the legs of their cattle. They don't even eat the head. In some places, they don't eat anything in the entrails, nothing, okay? And they dispose this directly as waste, okay? And I was shocked, so shocked, because the leg of a cattle in my country is damn too expensive that the poor people can't afford it on the streets of Abuja, anywhere in Nigeria. And so the quick business sense came to me. Why don't you pack all the waste meat in Ethiopia and ship it to Nigeria to feed all the, pack this thing to Nigeria to feed the teeming population of people who are paying so much for this, whereas the same thing is being thrown away in gutters and in refuse dump in Ethiopia. Hyenas come to the streets to pick cattle head and so on. So African Union is sitting out there. Nigerians are in African Union headquarters. Why can't we think of an ingenious way of making this exchange between these countries that are in need and those that don't need this kind of resource?
Yeah. Exactly. Well, that's a solution. That's a solution. So it's these little things that need to be found out, that where we can sort of start generating things where it's not wasteful and that some people benefit from other things, and you know, it fantastic. What an idea.
In South Africa, we eat the whole chicken.
If you can call it a chicken, Johan.
You can call it a chicken.
Yeah.
What the one population group doesn't eat, the other does. Cultural diversity is a beautiful thing.
Adam, there's another question that I've received here from Michelle Sussman, going, what's your take on intermittent fasting? We eat once a day, as we did historically. In fact, Michelle's got her hand up, so she can ask the question herself. Michelle, you're unmuted.
No, Alistair, you put it very well, thank you. But this issue of intermittent fasting is coming in at the moment, and our ancestors used to eat food when it was available. And at the moment, this business of having to eat 3 times a day, well, seems insane to me. You know, there's no reason to. You're not going to die of starvation. And I think that's a message we need to get out to people, is that, you know, there doesn't have to be, like you were saying, meat and 3 vegetables. You've got to have a starched protein and a green vegetable. It's not okay to eat once a day. Just choose what you want to eat.
Yeah. So, I mean, it is a good concept. I mean, look, you know, most of Africa are intermittent starving. You know, they're not doing it on purpose, but it's happening.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, but it's certainly in terms of that. I mean, I have to tell you, ever since I went vegan, it's quite interesting how less I found I needed to eat. I didn't have to eat as much as I did before, and it started to work. And so I think actually the consumption of meat, particularly the kind of meat that we're eating, and it's not healthy stuff. This is all processed meat and chicken and everything, is the kind of thing that generates us to eat more than we require. We kind of have this craving all the time, and the sugary food and all the diet in our diets, especially in the Western diet, is a major issue. So yeah, I mean, intermittent fasting is one aspect, or just reducing, you know, the unhealthy food. I mean, another easy, simple solution is just eat locally, you know, and you'll find that you're not going to eat as much as you normally do. You know, if you're eating McDonald's burgers every day, you're going to want to eat them all the time. So it's just one of those things. So there's so many different concepts that you can, or solutions that you can use in order to help, and whichever one suits you and helps you, as long as the overall result of preserving biodiversity is achieved, then go for it.